All right, so we've got a ton of material here about Herbert Hoover, ready for our deep dive.
Yeah, definitely a lot to dig into.
Looks like we've got an excerpt from an American history podcast.
That's right.
It seems like it'll be an interesting mix of expert commentary and historical narrative.
Definitely.
You think we'll get a better understanding of the man behind the myths?
I think so. Hoover is often remembered for the Great Depression,
Right.
but his life before that
Yeah.
is really full of surprises.
Okay.
It's a story of adventure and achievement
Interesting.
that most people just don't know about.
Okay, so let's start unpacking this.
Sure.
So he starts as an orphan in Iowa,
Right.
then ends up living with an uncle in Oregon.
Yep.
Not exactly the typical path to becoming one of the wealthiest men in the world, right?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
And he wasn't like a straight-A student either.
Really?
He actually struggled in school,
Hmm.
but excelled in practical fields,
Okay.
especially geology.
Geology. Interesting.
Yeah. So instead of just memorizing facts, he was out there getting his hands dirty,
I see.
figuring things out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This
This practical approach really shaped his problem-solving skills.
throughout his whole life.
Yeah, I think so.
So how does this hands-on geologist
Right.
transform into a mining magnate?
Well, picture this. It's the golden age of mining, and young Hoover is traveling the world.
Wow.
China, Australia, Russia.
He got around.
He was working in some of the most remote and challenging environments,
I bet.
managing teams, solving technical problems, navigating different cultures.
Talk about a global education.
Yeah,
I bet those experiences had a huge impact on his worldview.
absolutely. This wasn't a guy who was confined to a single perspective.
Right.
He had seen firsthand how different systems worked, how people from different backgrounds approached challenges,
Yeah,
and he was successful at it.
that's important.
By the early 1900s, he had become one of the wealthiest men in the world,
Wow.
leading this global mining consultancy
Rich.
based in London.
London. Wow, that's impressive.
Right.
But hold on, he meets his wife, Lou Henry, at Stanford.
That's right.
They start a family,
Yeah,
and they're living this adventurous life abroad
Right.
while he's running this massive business.
that's right. He and Lou were a real team.
Okay.
They embraced the challenges and the excitement of this global lifestyle.
Gotcha.
They actually had 2 sons while living abroad.
Wow.
So it was a true family adventure.
I have to admit, this is way more exciting than the stuffy history book image of Hoover I had in my head.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
There's a real human story here.
Yeah.
And then World War I breaks out.
Oh, boy.
And Hoover finds himself in London,
At the heart of it all.
at the heart of a global crisis.
And this is where his reputation as the master of emergencies begins.
Exactly. With Belgium caught in the crossfire of the war and
Right.
facing starvation,
Terrible.
Hoover stepped up to lead the Commission for Relief of Belgium.
Wow.
Imagine the logistical nightmare of organizing a fleet of 600 ships
600 ships.
to deliver food to a war-torn nation.
That's mind-boggling.
It really showcases his talent for organization resource management.
I can imagine.
Thinking on a massive scale,
Yeah.
he understood how to mobilize people and resources to achieve a complex goal,
Right.
and he wasn't afraid to innovate.
And it sounds like he was already a master of public relations even back then.
You're right. During World War I, he was tasked with convincing Americans to conserve food
Oh, yeah. On the home front.
on the home front to support the war effort.
Gotcha.
He understood that success wasn't just about logistics.
Uh,
It was also about winning hearts and minds.
Interesting.
So he embraced public messaging campaigns using the power of persuasion to achieve a common good.
That's fascinating.
Yeah,
So he's already got this track record of managing large-scale crises
right.
and understanding the power of public opinion
Yep,
before he even enters American politics.
exactly. And it's all connected.
Okay.
These experiences, the successes, the challenges, the lessons learned,
Yeah?
they all shaped his approach to leadership
Okay.
and would ultimately influence his decisions
Okay.
during one of the most challenging periods in American history.
You're talking about the Great Depression.
That's
Right.
right.
Because after World War I,
Yeah,
he transitioned into American politics,
right.
first as food administrator under President Wilson,
Uh-huh.
and then as Secretary of Commerce.
Right.
Okay.
And his time at the Commerce Department during the Roaring Twenties really solidified his economic worldview.
Interesting.
This was a period of incredible growth and innovation,
Yeah.
and he saw firsthand the power of American ingenuity and entrepreneurial spirit.
So by the time he wins the presidency in 1928,
Yeah.
he seems like the perfect man for the time.
Right.
Successful,
Yes.
experienced a symbol of American progress.
Uh-huh.
But then,
Then the bubble bursts.
oh,
Black Monday, October 28, 1929.
the crash.
The stock market crash sends shockwaves through the global economy.
Wow.
And suddenly, the man who had seemed destined for greatness finds himself facing a crisis of unprecedented scale.
And this is where things get really interesting, right?
Yeah,
Because his response to the Great Depression is so often debated and scrutinized.
exactly. And to understand his actions,
Right.
we have to understand the context of the time,
Of course.
his deeply held beliefs, and the economic forces at play.
Right.
But first, we need to unpack what actually led to the crash.
Okay.
It wasn't just a random event.
Yeah.
There were underlying factors that made the system vulnerable.
Okay, so let's get into that.
Yeah.
What were the warning signs that maybe people missed during the Roaring Twenties?
Well, the Roaring Twenties weren't all they were cracked up to be.
Mm-hmm.
Beneath the surface of prosperity, there were serious imbalances.
Okay.
For one thing, World War I had really messed things up globally.
Okay, so how did a war that ended in 1918 set the stage for an economic crash over a decade later?
It's all about interconnectedness.
Hmm.
The war had left European economies in shambles. They were heavily in debt to the U.S.,
Right.
and their industrial capacity had been decimated. This created a weird situation where America was producing way more goods than the rest of the world could actually afford to buy.
So too much supply, not enough demand.
Right.
I can see where that might be a problem.
Exactly. And to make matters worse, the U.S. had imposed high tariffs on imported goods.
Oh, yeah. Protectionism.
This was meant to protect American industries,
Right.
but it ended up hurting everyone
How so?
because it made it even harder for European nations to recover and buy American products.
It sounds like a vicious cycle.
It was. And then there was the problem of consumer debt.
Oh, yeah. Everyone is buying on credit.
During the 20s, it became really easy for people to buy things on credit cards, appliances, radios, you name it.
It was the new thing.
But this borrowing spree was built on shaky foundations.
Wow.
People were racking up debt they couldn't afford to repay, and the banks were overextended,
Lending money they didn't have.
lending money based on inflated asset values.
So it's like a house of cards just waiting for a gust of wind.
Exactly. And that gust of wind came in the form of a stock market crash.
Black Monday.
Over-speculation had driven stock prices to unsustainable heights. And when investors started to lose confidence, the whole thing came tumbling down.
And Hoover is stuck trying to pick up the pieces.
Right. And remember, this is 1929.
Yeah.
There's no blueprint for dealing with a crisis of this magnitude. The concept of a federal safety net,
Right.
with things like Social Security and unemployment insurance,
All that stuff didn't exist yet.
didn't exist yet.
Wow.
So how does the master of emergencies respond? Initially, he relies on the same principles that had worked for him in the past. Voluntarism,
Okay.
public appeals to patriotism, and a belief that the economy would eventually correct itself.
So a pretty hands-off approach.
He urged businesses to maintain wages and employment levels, hoping to prevent things from getting worse.
It kind of sounds like he was trying to apply a wartime mentality to an economic crisis.
You're not wrong.
Rally the troops, make some sacrifices, and we'll get through this together.
He even organized conferences, bringing together business leaders and government officials to coordinate relief efforts.
Okay.
He was drawing on his experience with large-scale organization,
From the war.
trying to manage a complex situation.
But it didn't work, did it?
Unfortunately, no. The economy kept spiraling downward. Businesses couldn't afford to keep people employed,
And people were losing their jobs.
and the situation on the ground was getting desperate. People were losing their homes, their savings, everything they had worked for.
And this is where the Hoovervilles start popping up, right?
Exactly.
Shanty towns full of people who had lost everything.
And those Hoovervilles became a powerful symbol of his perceived failure to address the crisis.
Yeah, I see that. And remember that Smoot-Hawley tariff we talked about earlier?
Oh, yeah.
That ended up making things even worse.
It did.
How so?
Well, it was meant to protect American industries from foreign competition,
Right.
but it backfired in a big way.
In what way?
Other countries retaliated with tariffs of their own,
Oh, no.
and it triggered a global trade war that strangled international commerce and deepened the depression worldwide.
It's like one bad decision compounding on top of another. But was it all Hoover's fault?
That's a complex question.
Hmm.
Some historians argue that his hands-off approach and his reluctance to embrace government intervention made things worse.
Okay.
They say he was too wedded to his ideology of individual responsibility and limited government,
Yeah.
even in the face of overwhelming suffering.
But others argue that he was a product of his time,
That's right.
that the idea of massive government intervention in the economy
Right.
was simply not part of the mainstream thinking back then.
And remember, he had seen firsthand the dangers of government overreach during his travels.
Right, he had traveled all over the world.
He had witnessed the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia,
Uh-huh.
the rise of fascism in Europe.
Oh, yeah, I can see how that would make him wary of too much government power.
He was deeply suspicious of centralized power and believed that it ultimately undermined individual liberty and stifled innovation.
So he was trying to walk this tightrope between doing something and doing too much,
Yeah.
but in the end, it wasn't enough.
By 1932, the country was desperate for change. Unemployment had reached 25%, and breadlines stretched for blocks in major cities. Hoover had become a symbol of hardship and failure, and a new leader was waiting in the wings, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
And FDR promised a new deal for the American people.
Exactly. He offered hope and a willingness to use the power of the federal government to address the crisis head-on, and the American people were ready for a new direction.
So Hoover loses the 1932 election in a landslide. Does that mark the end of his influence on American politics?
Not at all. Not at all. His defeat may have marked the end of his presidency, but it was also the beginning of his legacy as a staunch critic of the New Deal and a leading voice for conservative principles.
Interesting.
And his ideas would continue to resonate, shaping the conservative movement for decades to come.
Yeah, so even though he's out of office, Hoover's still a major figure in the political landscape.
Right.
It's interesting how his ideas about limited government and individual responsibility, which maybe seemed out of step during the Depression, become cornerstones of the conservative movement later on.
That's right. He really laid the groundwork for a conservative resurgence that would gain momentum in the decades following the New Deal.
Okay.
Figures like Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan drew heavily on Hoover's ideas,
Yeah, championing smaller government.
championing smaller government, lower taxes, and free market principles.
They saw him as kind of a role model.
They saw in Hoover a kindred spirit, someone who had stood up for these principles even when they were unpopular.
And it wasn't just a philosophical disagreement with the New Deal, was it?
No, it wasn't.
There was a real personal animosity between Hoover and FDR.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Their political rivalry was fueled by a genuine dislike for each other.
Really?
Hoover felt that FDR had unfairly blamed him for the Depression and that the New Deal was a betrayal of American values.
Interesting.
He saw FDR as a power-hungry opportunist who was using the crisis to expand the role of government at the expense of individual liberty.
So it's more than just a policy debate.
Right.
It's a clash of personalities and ideologies playing out on a national stage.
Exactly. And that clash would shape American politics for decades to come.
In what way?
Hoover's criticisms of the New Deal, his warnings about the dangers of big government, would continue to resonate with a significant portion of the population,
Makes sense.
particularly those who felt that FDR's programs were overstepping the bounds of government authority.
It makes you wonder how Hoover viewed his own legacy.
Yeah.
I mean, he went from being this celebrated figure, the master of emergencies,
Right.
to becoming the president most associated with economic hardship.
Well, he certainly felt that history had judged him unfairly.
Yeah?
He believed that he had done everything he could to address the Depression, given the constraints of the time and the prevailing economic theories.
I see.
He wrote extensively in his later years, defending his actions and arguing that the New Deal had actually prolonged the Depression by stifling private enterprise and creating a culture of dependency.
So he never really wavered from his core beliefs.
No, he didn't. And you have to admire his commitment to his principles, even in the face of adversity. He truly believed that limited government, individual initiative, and self-reliance were the keys to a prosperous and free society.
Whether you agree with his policies or not, there's no denying his integrity and his dedication to public service.
That's a good point. It's easy to get caught up in the political battles and lose sight of the human element.
Yeah,
This was a man who dedicated his life to helping others.
from the beginning.
From his early days in mining, to his humanitarian work during World War I, to his efforts to address the Depression, however flawed they may have been.
So as we wrap up, what do you think is the most important thing for our listeners to understand about Herbert Hoover?
I think it's essential to recognize that he was both a product of his time and a shaper of the future. His experiences in a rapidly changing world, his deeply held beliefs, and his responses to unprecedented challenges, both successes and failures, all contributed to the complex tapestry of American history.
Yeah, and perhaps his story serves as a reminder that leadership is a constant balancing act.
It is. Requiring a blend of pragmatism and principle, a willingness to adapt to changing circumstances while staying true to one's core values. And as we grapple with the economic and social challenges of our own time, it's worth reflecting on the lessons of the past, both the triumphs and the tragedies, as we chart our course for the future.